Thought Leadership from PwC's National Office.
Hello, I'm Heather Horn, PwC's U.S. Sustainability Technical Leader, and welcome back to PwC's Accounting Podcast. In today's special video episode, we're bringing you the latest updates on the European Commission's Omnibus package and its implications, including potential impacts to the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, or as we'll refer to them today, ESRS. And if you're listening and would like to watch this episode, check out the show notes for a link to the video. So this episode is a follow-up to an episode we recorded in March, which followed the initial announcement of the Omnibus proposals, which were published by the European Commission on February 26. So today we'll bring you the latest developments and some thoughts on what may be coming next. To walk through these updates, I'm happy to be joined once again by Diana Stoltzfus, National Office Partner, and who's also the co-chair of our Global Environmental Technical Working Group and a regular guest on the podcast. So, Diana, welcome.
Thank you, Heather.
All right. So, Diana, I know you're going to take us through all the updates and all the latest because it's sort of crazy that it's been just over 2 months because we're recording May 7th and so much has happened. But just in case some of our listeners didn't watch the prior episode, I'd like this one to be standalone. So I'm going to give a bit of background and then also to listeners, obviously, please check out the other episode if you haven't. So the Omnibus package actually included a number of different proposals, but we're going to focus in on two of them today. And these were two proposed changes. One referred to as stop the clock, and then one referred to as the content proposal. Now, those aren't real names, obviously, but they are how they can be referred to and help to distinguish. So the first one, stop the clock, is very easy to understand because it literally stops the clock on reporting for Wave 2 and Wave 3 reporters. And again, just as a reminder to everyone, Wave 2 reporters were supposed to report in 2026 on 2025 information. So basically report on this year's information. Right. And then Wave 3 was 1 year later. So this proposal moves those dates out by 2 years. And Diana, I know you're going to cover the status. One key question that we do get is that companies are not headquartered in the EU with significant activities in the EU. So those dates are still the same. So like I said, Diana will cover the status. And then the second proposal is called the content proposal. And there's four main parts, although we're going to focus mainly on one today. So it will change the entities and scope. And we go through this in detail in that last podcast.
Right.
Changes some to the value chain, a bit of changes to assurance, but then most notably proposed changes to ESRS. So as I said, we're going to talk a bit about what's happened since then, but I'll turn it over to you and maybe focus first on legislatively. And then, as I said to our listeners, don't worry, we're going to get to what's going on with the ESRS, which I think is of a lot of interest.
Right. So maybe I'll take them in the order that you had too. So and maybe one other point of information before we get into the discussion is also in the European Union, they have what's called the co-legislative process. So that means both the European Council and the European Parliament need to approve any proposal for it to become legislation. So starting with the stop the clock proposal. So the stop the clock proposal on April 3rd was approved by the European Parliament and then finalized by the European Council on April 14th. So the stop the clock now is official. I guess one point on that is that the directive has been published in the official journal of the EU, but it still does need to be transposed into national law by the member states. So the deadline for that to happen is the end of this year. So it's December 31st, 2025.
So before you go on to content proposal, one thing I think is quite interesting here is that we actually said on the last podcast, and this was even said at the time when these were released, that the reason they split them into two was because there was an idea that the stop the clock proposal would move very quickly. And then the whole intent there is to give time for the content proposal. And so obviously it's worked from that perspective that we now do see some surety for those Wave 2 reporters. You don't have to report this year end. Obviously, we encourage you to keep going, even with these changes we're talking about. But the other thing that we mentioned last time that I think is worth mentioning here is just the number of parties that are involved. Because, and I know you mentioned this last time, so I don't expect you to have the numbers on the top of your head, but the European Parliament has
742 or something. That's probably not the exact number.
Over 700.
Over 700. So a lot of different members that have to come to agreement. And it was, I think, pretty pretty overwhelmingly approved by the Parliament as well. So I think a lot of support for the stop the clock. I think once we get into the content proposal, maybe we'll hear it's a little bit of a different story. But I think to your point, even with the content proposal, as we'll talk through the dates and the changes, those are moving pretty quickly or have some pretty aggressive deadlines as well. So hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have a lot more information on kind of where everything's at with these standards.
Yeah, it should be interesting. And again, just with all these parties involved, it is good to see they were able to move so quickly on that and give that level of surety. So now content proposal, because I think we have a sense of the timeline for this as well, or at least a proposed timeline.
So they've started both in the council and in the Parliament. They've started the discussions on the content proposal. I think not surprisingly, there's a lot of different political parties, as you've alluded to, in the Parliament. And so I think a lot of different positions on what the content proposal should look like. Did it go far enough? Has it should
gone too far.
Right. So I think a lot of different views there. So they'll have to come to, and, as no party has the majority too, there'll have to be a reconciliation process and compromise among a number of different political parties to put together the proposal. So what we're hearing right now is that what's called the jury committee, which is like the legal affairs committee for the Parliament who's leading these discussions, they'll put together a draft report by the end of June. And then with a final vote on the proposal on October 13th is right now what the proposed timing is.
So it's very quick then to go through that. And I guess one point here, since I'm able to see this, but for our listeners' benefit, when you say jury, it's the acronym JURI.
Right.
And not to be confused with a jury. Yes, that's making decisions. So I know, it'll be interesting to see, I guess, because that is in some ways a ways away. It's 4 months or 5 months from now. But on the other hand, it's so fast. And so it will be interesting if there are many changes from the proposal that we saw that came out at the end of February, because I think for the listeners' benefit, you actually can see the full text of the proposal in, what was issued previously.
Right. Yeah. So you could see all the details around what they're proposing for these different changes that you walk through at a high level at the beginning.
Yes. So then, Diana, from that point of view, I think one of the areas that we probably have the most visibility into what may happen, and actually maybe there was less information in the proposal, is the potential changes to ESRS. And, obviously we went through wave one. There were a lot of learnings from wave one. I think some very good things, some very frustrating things. And so I think it was welcomed by many that they are relooking at ESRSs. But on the other hand, as I said to someone, this is like you took all of US GAAP, threw it up in the air and said, let me grab the pieces that I want and keep those. So from that perspective, what do we know about the process they're going to go through to make these changes to ESRS? And then also I should have asked you, or maybe we'll get to this, what they're sort of looking for. I think we'll get to that. So tell me process first.
We'll go through process first. So on March 27th, Commissioner Albuquerque, who's the commissioner with the European Commission, sent a letter to EFRAG requesting that they provide technical advice to the European Commission with respect to the simplification of the ESRS standards. When they're talking about technical advice, it really means a revised set of the ESRS standards. And they put together a deadline as of October 31st for when the revised standards need to be sent from EFRAG to the European Commission. In addition, they also asked EFRAG to provide a timeline for the activities that they'll undertake as part of that process and a work plan. So EFRAG on April 25th submitted their work plan to the European Commission, which included the deadline of providing the revised standard by the end of October. So right now, we're already, it started in April, but I think we're through that. So April to mid-May, they developed what they were going to call their vision for actionable levers aimed at the substantial simplification. And when I think about like actionable levers, I think what they're thinking about is kind of what are the guiding principles that they're going to use as they go through the simplification. But we can talk a little bit more about what those are in a minute. They'll also, right now, as you talked about, wave one reporters have issued. So they're going to look at, what's coming through in the wave one reports, getting feedback from stakeholders. They They also have a pretty comprehensive reach out plan, which includes both one-on-one interviews with both preparers and auditors, as well as workshops with a number of different other stakeholders. So, rating agencies, civil society organizations, academia, a very comprehensive plan to kind of reach out to all the different stakeholders and get their feedback. Once they have that feedback, they'll move into the next part of their plan, which starts in the second half of May and goes through July. That's when they're going to focus to actually drafting the different exposure drafts for amending the ESRS and starting to approve those with, throughout their own process. And then in August and September is when the public will see published drafts, exposure drafts of the, proposed changes to ESRS. And then during that time, they'll, analyze that, get feedback, et cetera. So our understanding is that the goal is to publish exposure drafts by the end of July, and then with a 30-day public comment period. So basically the month of August, yes. And then again, once they get that feedback, incorporating that and finalizing the updates to the standards by October 31st. So as you said, a very aggressive timeline, especially I think when we start to talk through the principles and like the pretty significant changes, I think that people think are coming and that EFRAG has kind of indicated that they plan to propose.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just a couple follow-on points. I'll just pick them out. So you mentioned the Wave 1 reports, and I would like to highlight that PwC did do this analysis of 250 Wave 1 reports, and we can put a link in the show notes, because I think when you and I were looking at it, some of what stands out the most is it does talk about by industry, which topics that were covered by these different industries, and some very interesting statistics. I think particularly as people are thinking about their own reporting, I think some of them we were a bit surprised by, but at least it still gives some directional benchmarking. So that was one point.
Yep.
The other thing, stakeholder reach out, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that you and I were both involved in developing PwC's sort of initial response to that reach out. And then in fact, I was able to join that meeting with the EFRAG staff. And it was very interesting to hear from them some of what they're thinking about. And I think we'll get a bit into some of our perspectives on what may happen.
Yeah.
Last point, though, I think we should talk about briefly, at least, what will happen next after EFRAG delivers the reports, because I think in many people's minds, there's this idea, okay, EFRAG is going to, quote, issue these new standards. You made a point, they're providing technical guidance.
Right.
So then do we have a sense of what may happen?
So it will be up to the European Commission at that point. And so the European Commission could make changes, could accept them, could go in a completely different direction. I think maybe pulling on one of the points that we talked about earlier is, the content proposal during the same period of time will be moving through its legislative process. And so, right now, in the letter that Commissioner Albuquerque or the European Commission sent to EFRAG, they said to base, the changes, these actionable levers, based on what was in the initial content proposal. So, focused on those types of simplifications. However, if it totally changes or there's a different focus that comes out of the legislative process, then, we'll have to see how that gets reconciled with the changes that EFRAG's proposing, because EFRAG won't have time to react if the timing kind of stays where it's at. You have October 13th with the content proposal and then October 31st. And so the timing is a little bit.
Oh, yeah, it's very short. And it is interesting because even with set one, we did see EFRAG, same thing. They made their proposal. Then the European Commission came out with their draft where there were a number of changes.
Right.
And then there was extremely brief additional comment period. And then the standards were issued. So we'll be interesting to see that. But one thing that I jotted down is, so you're saying if the vote goes forward and let's say it's passed and then it gets approved by the council, let's say that all happens in October, just for this purpose, then in the proposed, at least the way it's proposed now, the new standards would have to be issued within 6 months of that date. That's what's in the current proposal. Right. So if I'm trying to do my math quickly, I guess that would be the end of April that they would have to get issued. So you kind of can see why that October 31 deadline for EFRAG, because that still doesn't really give that much time for the Commission.
Yeah, and I think it was an interesting point too in the letter from the European Commission to EFRAG. They even made a point that acknowledging this timing issue with the content proposal, but saying that, they were hoping to issue the standards even sooner than that April time period, so that if because wave one reporters are still going to be required to report next year. So either under the existing set of standards, or there was some indication in the letter from the European Commission that the standards could be finalized and maybe that reporters in their second year could use these revised standards. I think
might be optimistic,
but there's obviously a lot of pressure to get these standards finalized. So it'll be interesting as both these revisions to EFRAG and the content proposal kind of move in parallel throughout this process. It'll be interesting to see how that interaction.
Yes, agree. So Diana, let's go back. You mentioned these levers, and I think they're quite aligned with what we saw in the Omnibus in terms of the ambitions for ESRS or the changes to ESRS. But can you just run through the four?
Sure. So the first one is revising the presentation and architecture of the ESRS. And so right now, you have the core cross-cutting standards, ESRS 1 and ESRS 2, and then you have all the topical standards, which cover, all of our different topics, climate change, biodiversity, the social topics, et cetera. And so there's, minimum disclosure requirements. There's disclosures around, your strategy and business model, governance, your impact, risk, and opportunity management. And there's those disclosures that are required within ESRS 2, the cross-cutting standards, but then there's also these incremental disclosure requirements in the topical standards. And it can be really hard to navigate the interaction and what's required and understanding. So it's kind of a confusing architecture. So they've committed to looking at that and thinking about, is there a way to make that easier or potentially reducing those requirements? The next one is thinking about what are the most challenging provisions in the standards. So really making sure that the standards are focused on material information, eliminating problematic data points, making sure that there's the right balance between the amount of effort that it takes preparers to report this information and the relevance of the information to users. Next is evaluating general burden reduction reliefs for ESRS. And you might be like, well, what exactly do we mean by that? But it's really thinking about, are there additional reliefs that we can provide, that EFRAG can provide in the standards or recommend in the standards to really reduce the compliance effort across the entire standard? So one of the examples that they provide is thinking about, if a company has done an acquisition or disposition in the year, thinking about providing some relief there. And we've talked about examples where, what if you have a significant acquisition in your fourth quarter? Are you really going to be able to have the time to get all that data, et cetera? That's one thing that they're thinking about. Are there reliefs that they can provide? And then the last one, which I think this one is maybe one of the top talking points that we hear from all the different regulators, is substantially reducing the number of required data points. So again, there's a focus on reducing the amount of narrative disclosures. I think we've seen a lot of these reports are very voluminous. And so really making sure that it's targeted on, the most relevant information, eliminating disclosures that, aren't decision useful. And then again, thinking about what are the existing EU regulations, what are the other, international standards requiring, and making sure that there's really good alignment between the two.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into interoperability in a bit, so I won't touch on it now because I do think some interesting things even from CSRD itself that there's maybe an opportunity to focus on. But let's go back then to this evidence gathering that you talked about in their work plan. And you also mentioned already started, we talked about the meeting that we had, but then in addition on April 8th, EFRAG issued a press release with a public call for comment, and the comment period ended May 6th, so right before we're recording this.
Yes.
But what was in that request? And then maybe we can talk a little bit at least about PwC's response and what we may expect to hear from others.
Yeah, and I think when walking through kind of the key areas that they asked about, I think you'll really see those actionable levers just kind of coming to life in the types of questions they asked. So it's, again, identifying the least important ESRS data points, what provisions need clarification, again, enhancing consistency with other EU legislation, improving the provisions on materiality, simplifying the structure of the standards, and then the point that you just made to increasing interoperability with the global standards. And so they had an online questionnaire. There was a number of different components kind of getting that. And then they also specifically were asking Wave 1 report. I mean, they asked all stakeholders,
Yes.
but there was a specific call to really understand Wave 1 reporters too, and what were their challenges, given that they were required to apply the standards in this first year.
Yeah, and I thought was one of the things that was interesting in the questionnaire. There were so many places where they actually were asking for data point specific recommendations. So either at the level of a disclosure requirement or the individual data points. So definitely they are digging, I'll say, into the detail in terms of what changes to make. But at the same time, I think if we take a step back, there's some major themes with these levers and otherwise. And we mentioned the meeting PwC had with EFRAG, but then you and I also had a chance to work with our global and EU counterparts to participate in PwC's response.
Right.
So can you just share a few, at least, of the key themes that we highlighted in terms of things PwC thinks would be helpful in terms of making change? Obviously, no promises, but hopefully our listeners will also agree that these would be beneficial.
Yeah. So maybe I'll start one of my favorite topics, materiality.
Yes.
So materiality of information. So I think, as we've talked about, in accordance with ESRS 1, an entity is required to perform a materiality assessment to identify its material sustainability related impacts, risks, and opportunities. And then once you've identified, then identifying and reporting on material information related to those. So you have those broad provisions, but then additionally within ESRS, there are some required disclosures that an entity is required to provide irrespective of their materiality assessment. So even when they've assessed a sustainability matter to be not material, there's still some disclosures that they're required to provide, and such as like the minimum disclosure requirements. Currently, those have to be provided for policies, actions, and targets. They're not subject to this concept of materiality of information. So one of our recommendations is that the concept of materiality of information should be able to be applied across all disclosure requirements. So there shouldn't be required disclosures that aren't subject to materiality. And then I think, kind of a subcomponent of that is right now, if you identify a sustainability matter to be material, and then you identify a data point that's related to that, even if that, material impact, risk, or opportunity originated in only a portion of your business or was related to a specific activity, you're required to report that metric for your entire consolidated entity. And so, that just means you have to report for everything, even though parts of that may not be really what drove your material IRO. And so we think it's important that you would be able to apply that materiality of information even at a data point level, so that you really can isolate that metric to really align with that impact, risk, or opportunity that you identified. So if that's related to a subsidiary, maybe a certain activity, maybe a specific location, so your IRO can be specific and then the metric can be specific to really provide users with an understanding of what's driving that.
Well, and I think that one in particular, Diana, we, some of the examples that we heard or that we saw ourselves in Wave 1 were things like, there was 80% of the metric came from only a small portion of the business, but then you spent 80% of the effort gathering the other 20%. And so I think it's those types of examples where this can make a huge change. And then obviously on the materiality, even things like the fact that you have to make the supplemental IRO 1 disclosures from the environmental standards, even if, let's say, biodiversity is not material, you still have to make actually quite a large group of disclosures. And so I think, these alone, if these were the only changes,
I think would have a really significant impact.
Me too. And I do think hopefully directionally, these are the types of things that they're looking at. But why don't you go on then? I know our next big area of recommendation was on the reporting boundaries.
Yeah. And so the reporting boundary is obviously a very important concept, because what's information is going to be included. And I think specifically, ESRS introduced this concept of your own operations versus the value chain, which in theory seems like it should be very easy, but in practice, distinguishing between really what's in your own operations and then where is that delineation between when do you cross into the value chain is maybe not as easy as you would think, especially when we're talking about different types of arrangements, thinking about leases, unconsolidated subsidiaries, joint ventures, and other types of contractual arrangements where it's it's not easy to really determine, well, is that in my value chain, or what parts of it are in my value chain, or is that my own operations? Also, there is some inconsistency too when the concept of operational control is introduced in some of the environmental standards, not only when we're talking about GHG emissions, which maybe we'll put that aside for a minute, but they bring that concept in some other areas where you need to look at operational control. So I think we feel like if EFRAG could provide some clear guidance or definition of like what's your own operations versus what's the value chain, and then also making that concept applied consistently across the standards so that companies aren't having to make these, different judgments depending kind of on what standard you're in. And I think maybe we'll put GHG aside from that, but I think that's overall our recommendation related to the reporting boundary.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting what you mentioned about there is operational control in the concept of operational control in some of the other environmental standards besides climate. And if you really dig into this, even the guidance on GHG emissions may not be fully developed about operational control, much less when you get into some of these other areas. So I think we think it's very important, and we did include in our recommendation that, again, putting GHG emissions aside, that they do not apply this concept of operational control and just use financial control outside of GHG. But lots of except GHG. So what are we saying about GHG?
Well, I think as you maybe mentioned, so the GHG protocol is the most widely used framework for measuring and reporting greenhouse gas emissions, and including setting targets of GHG emissions. And right now, the interaction between the ESRS, you have to consider the GHG protocol, but it's not exactly clear the interaction between the GHG protocol and ESRS. And then additionally, in the definition of the reporting boundary, the ESRS kind of create their own reporting boundary related to GHG emissions, which is inconsistent with the GHG protocol. So I think overall, we think given the, maturity, I mean, there's still, to your point, there's still some questions with the GHG protocol, but it is widely used that, aligning with the GHG protocol would really ease reporting for preparers. A lot of preparers, not all, but a lot have experience with it. There's, a lot of guidance out there related to it. And so leveraging that, we think would be really beneficial.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And then I know it's interesting, Diana, because we had a process within PwC to develop our recommendations, which included trying to identify sort of our individual must-haves. And then we brought those together as a group, and we'll get into some more detail on some of the data points. But I think this last recommendation probably is one, again, that could have a huge impact if you look at So in what area?
So maybe this is broadly the structure of the standards. There's a couple different subcomponents that we think could be important when they're thinking about the structure. I think one is maybe starting with this relationship between ESRS2 and the topical standards that I touched on in the beginning, that there's these requirements in ESRS2, I don't know, and the topical standards, and that's really confusing. And there's a lot of duplication too between those. So I think our recommendation would be to remove the incremental requirements from the topical standards, and then think about whether it would make sense to include those as like illustrative examples or application guidance or something else. But it also feeds into our other recommendations as well. So I think that's one thing that we think would really make it easier to follow in the standards. And then the second is kind of what I touched on is also there's these May disclosures that are included within the disclosure requirements. Then sometimes there's examples. Then you also have the application requirements, which sometimes have additional requirements. And so I think, we think all the required disclosures should be included in the disclosure requirements. Take everything else out that's not a required disclosure. And then instead of application requirements, make it application guidance. So making it more clear, like these are not required. They're intended to provide illustrative examples. There, might be some voluntary disclosures. Sometimes there's areas where there are no required disclosures, but there might be some examples that could be helpful as companies are trying to think through what would be a disclosure for an IRO they've identified. And then the last is in relation to these voluntary disclosure points, these May is really for EFRAG to take a hard look and do they really need them? So either considering should they just be deleted entirely? I think in very limited circumstances, maybe becoming a required data point. And then again, if we think that they're helpful, examples or something, then should they be included in what we're calling application guidance?
Yeah, I think that's an important recommendation. So one thing I wanted to touch on as well, I mentioned previously that there were so many questions about data points. I know you are very familiar with PwC's data point recommendations, but do you want to just highlight quickly how we gathered those recommendations and then ultimately what we shared with EFRAG on this individual data point level?
Yeah, I think we had a pretty good process from my personal view. We have these environmental working groups, social working group, governance working groups, that GHG working group. Yes. And so we gathered input from all of our working group members, which includes, representatives from across our entire global network. We also reached out to the assurance leaders. So those that are working with on providing assurance over these reports and asking for their feedback on, these same kind of questions, right? What are the most problematic data points? Where did you have challenges? What would you like to see changed? What would make it easier? Where do we need more guidance? And so we gathered all of those different feedback points. We got over 270 different recommendations across many different data points. And so, we went through, a really thoughtful process of, some were related to the same data point, some were duplicative, obviously people had similar suggestions. And so really narrowed those down to what did we think were really actionable items that we should recommend to the commission. I will make one caveat too. We really didn't feel like our role was to say which data points necessarily should be removed, that we didn't want to recommend necessarily. We thought that was really for users to say what information they think is the most relevant. There were a couple instances where data points, really
there was just issues.
There was a real issue with it. So in some limited circumstances we did, but just broadly we didn't. But so that resulted in, I think, over 60 recommendations that we had on a data point level that we provided to the commission as well.
Yeah. So definitely a lot of detail. If people are interested, that our letter, we'll put a link in the show notes. And so anyway, I think, Diana, it will be from this perspective, it'll just be interesting to see what ESRS or what EFRAG does next. I think we understand they're expecting a huge volume of responses to the questionnaire. So they'll have to do a lot of sifting through. And then it's a very short period of time before we'll actually start to see those drafts of the standards. So, from a listener point of view, I think it's important to kind of keep up and see what's happening. As I mentioned at the very beginning, there were many aspects to this proposal, one of which is probably at least equal interest to many of our listeners, which were some proposals related to the EU taxonomy. So I don't want to get into too much detail, but can you just give a quick status update on where those proposals stand?
Sure. So the European Commission proposed amendments to the taxonomy delegated acts and asked for public feedback. So that feedback period ended at the end of March. So next they'll go through the co-legislative process that we talked about before. So approval by the European Commission and the European Parliament. And then once that happens, if they're adopted by both of those, they'll go under the scrutiny period, again, by the European Parliament and the Council. And then if there's no objections, they will go into force and they would be applicable on January 1, 2026. The difference here with these delegated acts is that they do not require transposition. And so as soon as they become law, then they'll go into force.
And then, Diana, sorry, you may have said this. When is the timeline for adoption?
In Q2. So within the next month or so.
Q2. So fast. Yes. Okay. So I guess more to come on that. And maybe that's a good segue because it's so interesting in the world of sustainability. Obviously, people who are in this space, it's moving so rapidly, but right now seems to be like a particular pace, advanced piece of change because we have what's going on with the ESRS's taxonomy. And then I'm going to be recording a separate podcast with one of our other colleagues, Marcin Olowinski, who is the chair of the GHG working group. And we are going to be talking about proposals related to the GHG protocol. Yeah. And then as well at the ISSB, they have 2 exposure drafts out. So it's a lot to keep track of. And that kind of leads to my final question for you. So if you are a company who's either, subject to reporting in California, maybe you're voluntary reporting, maybe you're a wave 2 company for ESRS, maybe you have operations in territories where there's ISSB. Right. There's so many moving parts and in particular, so much change right now. So what would you recommend when you're talking to clients?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a tough time with so much change going on all at once. But I think that just puts more importance on the diligence of staying on top of these different, changes as they move through their various different processes. I think also going back to the point is we still don't hear really of any changes with the double materiality process for ESRS. So I think as companies, if they've gone through their double materiality process and they've identified what matters or material, I still think that's a really important part of the process. And then maybe, thinking about which specific data points they have to report on, they might have a little bit more time with that. But I don't think we think stop in any way. And many of these are moving very quickly. And so you think about October is, less than 6 months away. And if there's going to be a view and even sooner on what these potential changes are going to look like, I think, companies will be getting some insight soon. So I think, staying on top of it and continuing to move forward with the information you have.
All right, that's helpful. And then I think you and I spoke before we started this episode that we're going to start trying to do monthly or maybe every other month, but probably right now monthly episodes just to give updates, just to help people stay on top of what's going on. So as always, Diana, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Great to talk to you, Heather. Thank you.
Thank you. And then to our listeners, thank you as well for listening or viewing us today. As always, we appreciate it. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be joined next week by Marcin Olowinski talking about the proposed changes to the GHG protocol. So obviously, these are very important, particularly to companies that will be subject to the rules in California or who will be reporting under ESRS. And then for all of our episodes, definitely check out our page at viewpoint.pwc.com. Thanks again.
That's our show for today. Tune in next week for more fresh episodes. So that you never miss any of our audio content, follow the PwC Accounting Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. And to stay up to date on all our latest accounting and reporting news, sign up for our newsletter at viewpoint.pwc.com. From Thought Leadership at PwC, I'm Heather Horn. Thanks for tuning in.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates, and they sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors, including accountants and lawyers.